All right, here's what my colleague Juliet Homer and I will be covering during our presentation. First, I'll put distribution planning in the context of other electricity planning processes and talk about some drivers for increasing regulatory engagement in distribution planning. And next, I'll provide a snapshot of state objectives and requirements and some of the common procedural and substantive elements for distribution plans, particularly those that include distributed resources. And then I'm going to drill down into two areas that were discussed earlier today, but from a regulatory perspective instead of a technical one, which you heard earlier: procurement strategies for non-wires, alternatives, and hosting capacity analysis. And then Juliet Homer will wrap up with several other regulatory issues, data-related requirements, stakeholder engagement, how to get going with a distribution planning proceeding, and emerging issues. We provide hyperlinks throughout the slides that are posted on the Berkeley Lab website. Look at the link that we put in the chat box. So you can look at the citations and learn more and maybe adapt for your own state. And in the back of our deck under extra slides, we include state-by-state approaches with lots more links. Next slide. So let's start with electricity planning and drivers, and one more. Next slide, please. All right, so distribution planning is really talking about the local grid. We're assessing the physical and operational changes that we need to address. It's an annual process to identify and define distribution system needs, to assess possible solutions, and then select the projects to meet those needs. There's a long-term capital plan for the identified solutions, and that's typically over a 5 to 10 year period, and that's refreshed every 1 to 3 years. Integrated resource planning, where it still applies in your region, it identifies future investments to meet the bulk power system needs. And as part of that, utilities can consider multiple scenarios for both loads and distributed resources, and the impact that has on the need for and timing of utility resource investments. And finally, transmission planning identifies future expansion needs for the high voltage delivery system and options for meeting those needs. And there are other planning practices: energy efficiency, demand side management, increasingly electrification, and state climate plans. So through an integrated planning process, these multiple load and resource scenarios can be considered in a consistent way throughout the distribution and bulk power systems. Next slide, please. So why might states be interested in distribution planning? As we revealed in our poll, one reason is that investments in distribution systems are really large. For US investor-owned electric utilities, they count for the largest portion of CapEx, some $39 billion in 2019. Next slide, please. So states are responding to a variety of other drivers for improved planning. First, we just have increasing deployment of distributed resources. Some of this is disrupted. We're not disruptive. We're not just, planning for all of this. These are things that customers are bringing into play. And that's happening because of reduced technology costs, but also state policies, new business models that utilities and third-party providers have, and in customer interest. Storage and microgrids, you'll hear more about that tomorrow, connected at the distribution level. They're increasingly being deployed to improve resilience and reliability of the electricity system. And with new technologies and systems, we have a lot more data. Luckily, we have better tools to analyze that data. We can harness that to improve planning and operating distribution systems. As you all know, many utilities are proposing to update aging grid infrastructure. Distribution planning can help put all of those proposals in a much broader and longer term context. And there are areas across the country, certainly in the MISO footprint, with high levels of variable energy from wind and solar. And those areas have increasing need for grid flexibility. Resources at the distribution level can help, like storage and demand response and energy efficiency that are targeted at the right times and right places, in tandem with natural gas plants for flexibility. There's increasing interest in utilities operating distribution systems more efficiently. You heard from Kevin Schneider yesterday about conservation voltage reduction and volt bar optimization, all to reduce energy waste on the distribution system. and non-wires alternatives to traditional solutions may provide net benefits to customers in certain cases. Next slide. So there are other potential benefits from improved planning. And for me, first and foremost, having that holistic and longer-term picture of utility plans for distribution capital is really important before the utilities actually make the investments and they show up individually in rate cases or in rider proceedings. Second, provides opportunities for PUC and stakeholder engagement, and in a meaningful way that can improve outcomes. Distribution planning also can consider a broader range of possible futures, consider solutions that can achieve the desired system at least cost, considering risk, and maybe motivate the utility to choose those best solutions for customers. And also enabling consumers and third-party providers to propose grid solutions and participate in providing grid services. That's an increasing focus of a lot of states. You'll see that in a lot of state proceedings. Next slide, please. So, as Paul has mentioned repeatedly, next slide, please. States, it's really important to establish their objectives for distribution planning, and hopefully the practices they set follow those objectives. So, for example, in Michigan, the Public Service Commission initially set 4 objectives: safety, reliability and resiliency, cost effectiveness and affordability, and what they've called accessibility, which includes reasonably accommodating service to new or existing customers without causing any major network upgrades because of some kind of underlying infrastructure challenge. And the Commission is also exploring, as part of that, resource diversity as part of accessibility. Turning to Nevada, the legislature there focused on contributions to meeting local generation and distribution capacity needs, as well as benefits for safety, reliability, and cost savings. And in Minnesota, the legislature established grid modernization objectives around reliability, security, and energy conservation and demand response opportunities. And the Public Utility Commission set several objectives for distribution planning. Next slide, please. Last year, the Electric Power Research Institute reported that there were legislative or regulatory efforts underway to modernize the distribution planning process in half the states in the country. The most common requirements related to data sharing and transparency, hosting capacity, non-wires alternatives, including identifying which grid needs may be candidates for solutions, specific requirements for distribution plans, and that included documenting the process and the utility's capital investment plan, as well as establishing procedures to better incorporate distributed resources and locational value to systematically analyze costs and benefits of distributed resources to determine the net benefits they can provide for specific areas of the grid. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of distribution planning requirements across the country, both legislative and regulatory actions. We published the first version of this table in our 2017 report on state engagement in electric utility distribution planning. We revised it for an update of that report a year later, and we updated it again for this presentation. And what we found is that the changes reveal a rapid increase in the number of states and the types of requirements over this short period of time. Next slide. So here we provide links to state filing requirements for both distribution and grid modernization plans. And some states have both, and some states are in the process of sort of merging those. So these are just examples. The list doesn't show every state that's taking action or every action that each state is taking, but it gives you a good sense. And as we showed on the last slide, at least 16 states and the District of Columbia have established requirements to file distribution plans or grid modernization plans or both. And utilities in several other states are filing grid modernization plans on their own motion. By our count, at least 8 states, plus the District of Columbia, require some sort of hosting capacity analysis or maps, or both. And about a dozen states require utilities to consider non-wires alternatives for certain types of distribution needs like load relief and reliability, and then to consider the locational value of these resources. And several states are actually providing explicit benefit cost analysis frameworks for evaluating non-wire solutions. And states may require utilities to actually file handbooks. This is all about providing transparency on methods. It's much the same as we've had for decades for demand-side management, where those frameworks are rooted in the cost-effectiveness tests that are based on avoided costs. Next slide, please. So I pulled together on the next several slides a synthesis of the range of both procedural and substantive requirements for distribution planning. So let's starting with here with procedural elements. Really, the first consideration is, well, how frequently should utilities be making these filings? And there have been adjustments over time within states as they gain some practice. Typically, utilities are required to file a distribution plan every year or every 2 years. And some states allow more time between filings. For example, Nevada requires utilities to file a distributed resources plan as part of the utility's integrated resource plan, so the filing frequency aligns with that at 3 years. There are some other considerations as well with respect to how frequently utilities file plans, including alignment with the utility's capital planning process, the workload both for the utility and the commission and stakeholders, and a timeline that facilitates both making and tracking progress on goals and objectives. So is it too short a time frame? Is it too long, or is it just about right? So a lot of things to balance here. Another important procedural element is the planning horizon. That is, how long a time period are we looking at? So typically there's both a near-term action plan, which can be 3 to 5 years, and there's also a long-term plan that can be 10 years or more. Among the considerations for setting that planning horizon are interest in understanding both short-term and long-term investment, and coordination with integrated resource plans where they exist, including the term of the action plan for the integrated resource plan and matching that up. At the same time, we recognize that distribution planning is far more granular. Location-specific needs really change on a shorter time frame than bulk power system needs, and they're, I think, also both are fairly uncertain. So there's sort of arguments for a shorter and a longer time frame. Stakeholder engagement is something that Juliet is going to cover shortly in this presentation. Next slide, please. And those requirements really vary quite a bit. All right, confidentiality is another sort of procedural element that commissions, address in every proceeding. In the case of distribution planning, one area where this really comes up is with hosting capacity maps. Some utilities display the feeders in the maps with buffer zones to mask the exact route details because they're concerned about some information related to critical distribution infrastructure. But in New York and California, they've worked this out, and the maps there show feeder routes without buffer zones. So commissions have gone different ways on this issue. And of course, there's a host of competitive and proprietary considerations that raise confidentiality issues like the ones I've listed here. Next slide. All right, let's turn to substantive elements. And what do the filed plans actually need to include? So the requirements include providing baseline statistics on equipment and system components. And for example, there may be an interest in not just understanding the basic elements, but what advanced components do you have? How much SCADA do you have? Where is it? How many advanced meters have you deployed? Versus just like the basic meters. Additionally, metrics like SAIDI, SAIFI, and CAIDI that measure the duration and frequency of interruptions, both on the system and for customers, equipment ages and conditions, and historical spending by category to provide some context. Also included is a description of the utility planning process. That includes load forecasting, focusing on projected peak demand. Ideally, the utilities are applying scenarios increasingly to account for various drivers of load changes. That includes historical load growth, weather history, customer planned load additions, and disruptive events like we're experiencing today with COVID. Utilities also consider new sources of demand, whether it's increasing levels of air conditioning, which we're seeing in various parts of the country, and in pretty much all over, we're seeing increased levels of electric vehicles, and also the growth of other distributed resources. The utility is conducting risk analysis on its feeders all the time and substation transformers, concerned about potential for overload. And as part of the distribution planning process, they're developing a mitigation plan to address all of these concerns. Ultimately, the utility develops a budget for planned capacity projects. They've got to take into account all sorts of things, from the health of the distribution assets already on the system reinforcements that may be needed, upgrades that may be needed to meet capacity needs, reliability and other criteria, and the new systems and technologies that the utility is planning to put in, for example, for grid modernization. So they've got to prioritize this. They can't do everything all at once. So they use criteria to prioritize the projects that ultimately that they design and construct. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that these distribution plans should have a pretty strong emphasis on distribution operations. That includes the very important task of vegetation management, as well as how the utility is going to manage reliability and resilience events. Next slide, please. So two key drivers for distribution planning requirements by states are consideration of distributed energy resources and grid modernization strategies. So these are really driving some of these distribution planning requirements. So with respect to distributed resources, utilities are forecasting both the types and amounts that they expect to see on their system and the net load impacts on the grid. Also key is analyzing hosting capacity and non-wires alternatives, and I'll provide example state requirements for those in just a moment. As Paul talked about, distribution plans inform grid modernization strategies and vice versa. In some states, regulated utilities are seeking some sort of blessing, such as a certification from the Public Utility Commission, in advance of making major grid modernization investments. Another important element of plans is the action plan. You can consider this a near-term roadmap for the utility's capital investments and operational expenses for major technologies, systems, tools, and activities. And then commissions may have some additional requirements, for example, requiring a long-term plan that includes the utility's long-term vision, understanding where integrated resource planning applies, how distribution planning is coordinated with that, understanding what strategies utilities are using to engage their customers in the plan. Are they learning about their preferences for grid services? Are they learning about ways that customers would be willing to provide grid services if provided the opportunity to do so? There's usually some requirement to summarize the stakeholder engagement in the planning process. And then it's a typical place to put proposals for pilot programs. For example, for assessing non-wires alternatives, for piloting time-varying pricing, like critical peak pricing, for example, and for managed charging for electric vehicles. Next slide. So this graphic is from Xcel Energy's 2019 Integrated Distribution Plan. And I really like it because it's very simple and it shows the evolution in distribution planning practices. So starting at the bottom with a traditional focus on peak demand forecasts, and then layering on top of that forecasts of distributed resources, and then considering multiple scenarios, both for loads and resources. And then the more advanced steps from there are more formally integrating distribution planning with both power system planning and routinely considering non-wires alternatives, including their locational value. And at the very top is harnessing distributed resources for a wide range of grid services, not just, for example, for load relief or reliability. And this is something that Natalie will talk about more tomorrow. Next slide, please. So let's dive briefly into requirements for procuring non-wires alternatives. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, these are options for meeting system needs related to load growth, reliability, resilience. There's really a range of options. It could be a single large distributed resources like a big battery, or it could be a portfolio of distributed resources like a battery, together with demand response and targeted energy efficiency. Distributed resources can provide load relief, address over or under voltages, reduce interruptions, enhance local resilience, and meet local generation needs. And there's promise that these non-wires solutions could reduce utility costs by either deferring or avoiding infrastructure upgrades, or putting solutions in place incrementally to provide a flexible way to address the uncertainty that we have in load growth, understanding what that's actually going to be. And you could potentially avoid some large upfront costs for forecasted load that may not actually show up. Typically, the utility is issuing competitive solicitation for non-wires alternatives for very specific system needs, and then compares those bids to its planned traditional grid investments, like a substation transformer, to determine the lowest reasonable cost solution, and very importantly, considering risk. Next slide. So to provide greater transparency and a more systematic process, some states have required regulated utilities to do two things. One is develop predetermined criteria for the kinds of capital investments that will include consideration of non-wires alternatives, and two, regularly assess opportunities to use them to defer or avoid large investments. For example, in New York, regulated utilities must routinely identify distribution project candidates and then screen potential non-wires alternatives using established suitability criteria, including project type, timeline, and cost. Next slide, please. So here's an example of setting needs and considering distributed resources in competitive solicitation to meet certain types of distribution needs. The need here identified is most often a load reduction quantity. So we're talking about, load reduction in megawatts that would enable the utility to defer or avoid a specific capital investment. The identified need includes the date by which the non-wires alternative would need to be operational and the time periods during which it would need to reliably operate. Next slide, please. California has established a distribution investment deferral framework that Debbie mentioned earlier today to procure distributed resources where they can cost effectively defer or avoid traditional investments. The regulated utilities publish a grid needs assessment annually that identifies grid needs for the next 5 years. And at the same time, utilities also must publish a distribution deferral opportunities report that identifies locations where non-wires alternatives may be a feasible and cost-effective solution. And by December 1st each year, the utilities file a list of distribution investment deferral opportunities, and they request the Public Utilities Commission approval to issue competitive solicitations for that. Next slide, please. All right, finally, I'll cover one example of hosting capacity analysis requirements. Minnesota. So in Minnesota, they established their policies and regulations on hosting capacity analysis over the past 5 years. It starts with a state law that requires the largest utility, Xcel Energy, to analyze hosting capacity for what they called small-scale distributed generation. And the commission defined that as a feeder level analysis annually for solar PV at or below 1 megawatt. And the analysis needs to be at a level of detail that's sufficient to inform both the utility's distribution planning and the utility's potential distribution upgrades for efficient integration of distributed solar. So far, the utility has filed 4 hosting capacity analyses, and each time the commission reviews the analysis, it provides guidance for improvements for the next cycle of analysis. Next slide, please. So, for example, the commission required the most recent filing to include mitigation options and costs. So don't just tell us, where you're out of hosting capacity or where you know, it's still plentiful, but tell us where we're running out. You know, what could we do to mitigate that, and what would it cost? So it's very interesting because the utilities found that for about half the feeders that they analyzed, hosting capacity increased by an average of 1.9 megawatts each, with either no cost solutions or solutions that were quite low cost, under $5,000, for projected over voltage or thermal violations. So these are the most common. And so recently the Commission adopted a long-term goal to use hosting capacity analysis in fast-track screens for the interconnection process. So the analysis that's due from Xcel Energy in a couple of weeks must include cost estimates for more frequent updates for that use case, and also a cost-benefit analysis for other advanced applications for interconnection. In addition, the utility is going to begin exploring analyzing loads like electric vehicles in hosting capacity analysis to support the state's goals for transportation electrification, and that's something that other states like California have already begun doing. Next slide, please. I think we are on to Juliet's portion of the presentation. Juliet?
Okay, hi everybody, happy to be here. I'm Juliet Homer from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I'm going to talk about data-related requirements. So next slide, please. So as different states are moving into these distribution system planning dockets, a key thing that keeps coming up is data, and that's something we've talked about today and yesterday. But there are a lot of issues about data that are being addressed, namely who has it and who gets it. I think the Hawaiian Public Utility Commission said it well in an order. They said they recognize that limited data visibility could lead to inefficient customer and grid investments. So this is one of the reasons that the data issue is being addressed. And when we talk about data availability, there's really two different types. One is customer usage data, and then the other is system level data. So with customer usage data, it's really about making customer AMI data available to both customers and third parties to support decision making. And some states are requiring utilities to use or consider using the green button framework. And that's really got two parts to it. The first is a part that's called Download My Data, and it's a standard that enables customers to download their own AMI data. And that's a little bit more common, but there's another aspect to the green button data, which is Connect My Data. And this data is in a data exchange protocol, which allows the automatic transfer of data from utilities to the third parties upon customer authorization. And then some states, as they're sharing customer AMI data, they use the 15 by 15 rule for aggregating customer data. And that basically says that if an aggregated sample is shared, it must contain more than 15 customers, and no single customer can represent more than 15% of the total aggregated data. So it's a way to share data, but also protect customer privacy. So also next, talking about system level data, this is something else that's coming up in a lot of these proceedings. And as Lisa talked about hosting capacity maps, I mean, that's an example of that, where, you know, the system level data is being made available to developers and others. And I'm going to talk through a few examples because this is an important issue around data. So next slide, please. So I think New York is a good example of being very transparent with data. You know, they've opted for this distributed system operator model. And the picture here is an excerpt from a newsletter from the Joint Utilities of New York, and it's got a link to some data sharing portal. And so each utility has, you know, links to their hosting capacity maps, and then if you go to the Joint Utilities New York website, it has links to all of these different types of data. And as you know, as we look around at the different dockets, this list here of these little bullet, you know, punch boxes, it really incorporates kind of what we're seeing in terms of the types of data that are being requested and contested in some cases, or talked about. And you know, these are things like just the plans themselves, the distribution system plans. What are the capital investments the utilities are looking at? What are the planned resilience and reliability investments? Reliability statistics, hosting capacity, identifying the beneficial locations. You know, where on the system would it be most beneficial to have DERs installed? Load forecasting, non-wires alternatives, and others. So let's go on to the next slide. So Lisa talked about the California process, And it's an interesting one where they do, the utilities do these grid needs assessments, and they look through their system and say, okay, here's what the grid needs. And then they do these distribution deferral opportunity reports, which are like non-wires alternatives, and these are the opportunities to defer traditional investments. So along with these filings in California, they're also required to make data sets available. And so this slide lists those data sets that are required to be made available by the California utilities, and really broken down into 3 categories. The grid needs, and those are all listed here, that type of information. And then in terms of the potentially deferrable projects, information on the planned investments that could be deferred, and then information on what candidate deferrals, kind of the characteristics of projects that could be candidate deferrals. So that's California, and you can take a look at that order. That's linked here, and it's got all the details of the data that's required. Next slide, please. So as we move on to the District of Columbia as an example, so District of Columbia had this whole MedSys process, and as part of that, they had a data information access and alignment working group. So a working group that was focused on these issues of data access. And that group came up with a list. Basically, they said, here's a long list of all the things that we'd like, all the data sets that we'd like access to. And the commission required a data sharing portal on PEPCO's website. But what's interesting is, not all of the data sets that were requested were going to be made available. And as someone asked the question before, there are these security issues, and I think, each state is handling that in a different way. But as you can see, it's really small here, but, certain types of data here require a non-disclosure agreement. If you look there, the load data requires a non-disclosure agreement. The working group said they would like to know about beneficial locations for investments, and the utility replied that the information is not available yet. Moving down to the second one, there's a whole host of information that they require secure access in order to access the data sets. So it's not easy, and each state's doing it in a different way, but I think District of Columbia has been thoughtful about it, and it's an interesting example to consider. So next slide, please. So when we talk about stakeholder engagement, you can go on to the next slide. So stakeholder engagement is often required in distribution planning before a plan is filed, as well as after the plan is filed. So before, this can vary from, for instance, in Minnesota, just having, requiring one timely stakeholder meeting before the plan is filed, all the way up to having significant upfront input through working groups, as some of the other states require. And then also after the plan is filed, the opportunity for engagement there. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Hawaii and New York, but I want to point to New Hampshire. They established a stakeholder group, and they really put this group to work. There's real specific recommendations or responsibilities that this group has to make recommendations on things like assumptions and metrics, and load and DER forecasting methodologies, as well as hosting capacity, interconnection, and locational value approaches. The image here on this slide is actually a snap from the New York Joint Utilities website. And so I just think it's interesting how kind of clearly laid out everything is here. You can click on hosting capacity, non-wires alternatives. You can go to the filings from the utilities. You can look at, a bunch of different things. So this is one approach. Next slide, please. This is a little bit more from the New York process. And so and this was taken from the newsletter, but kind of moving from left to right, they have a whole host of things that they're doing on their stakeholder engagement. They have stakeholder surveys that they send out as a way to try and improve plans from year to year. Then there's the webinars, there's the quarterly newsletters, and then this website that I mentioned, and then company-specific stakeholder meetings. So next slide. As we look at Hawaii, they have the integrated grid planning process, and if you're interested in this subject, really interesting website there with a link to it. But as you look at these 4 large purple boxes, these are the aspects of the stakeholder engagement process in Hawaii. They have broad public engagement, which includes basically different meetings and virtual open houses where they go to the islands, they meet in high schools or universities, and they try and engage people just in a broad way. There's a stakeholder council that includes representatives from cities and counties and a variety of folks, including the usual participants and dockets, but also reaches into the community. There's working groups, as well as a technical advisory panel of experts from around the country that voluntarily are advising on processes, methodologies, and technologies. Next slide. All right, so getting started, and you can go on to the next slide. You know, we looked around at how are folks getting started with this? There's some good examples to look at of what others have done, you know, and links to everything in case you're interested. But, you know, in some cases, staffs have started by developing a report or a white paper outlining what are the key needs, why are they doing this, you know, what are the goals, what's the vision. In a number of states, they've issued surveys as to get started, surveys targeting utilities and stakeholders. And then often there'll be some initial meetings to kind of go through those surveys and to really try and understand the current processes, the data that's available, and really the current filings and maybe how they all fit together. Other states have hosted presentations or trainings for the staff and stakeholders. And sometimes this includes taking a look at guidelines that have been developed for other states for distribution system planning. Something interesting that New York did is before they had the utilities file their first plan, they had the utilities file their stakeholder engagement plan. And then they followed that up with an initial distribution system plan and then follow-on plans. And the initial plans sometimes just establish the baseline, just understand the current system, current processes, and then the additional plans can kind of be more forward-looking. So just some ideas there. Next slide. All right, so in emerging issues, and these are going to be my last two slides after this. You can go ahead to the next one. So just a few emerging issues we wanted to touch on with you. One is fire risk, and some of these things can be applied to other risks, maybe in other locations, but in California, they required utilities to develop these wildfire mitigation plans. And if you're interested in this, we've got a lot of extra information, other information in the extra slides, and there's actually just a lot of information in general in the extra slides. So if you're interested in this presentation, it's chock full of information in the back here. But the California wildfire mitigation plans, you know, require utilities to identify the high-risk zones and how they're going to, handle enhanced inspections, what strategies they're going to use for sectionalizing lines to minimize areas that need to be de-energized, automatically recloser strategies, among other things. So pretty interesting to look at that. Affordability is another emerging issue, and the California PUC's recent decision in affordability docket establishes 3 metrics, and they're listed here. And the New York Public Service Commission has also looked at low-income issues, and in May of 2016 had an order that directed the utility to make filings and adopted a framework for addressing low-income customer needs. Next slide. All right, and so in terms of another emerging issue, and we've heard a little bit about this, but is DER compensation tariffs that are based on locational value. In New York, they have what they call the value stack tariff, and it compensates distributed energy resources based on the location in addition to other things. But as you see here, the map here is a Con Edison map where they went through their service territory, the Brooklyn section, and identified areas that they had called location specific relief value zones. And these are zones that could particularly benefit from system relief through distributed energy resources, like load relief. So for DERs located in these green areas, in these location-specific relief value zones, they get additional compensation if they're able to provide energy services during call events. So this is another kind of interesting emerging example from New York. All right, so next slide. So we've got lots of resources for you here. Take a look, a lot of great reports and things that you can reference. And then I think the next slide is just the closing. So turn it back over to Carrie.
Thank you so much, Ms. Homer. That was really great. It's really nice hearing all the different things that all the states are doing, and for you to capture it all in one place was just really spectacular. It's one of those on my bucket list, but I'm really glad that you got to it. So thank you so much. Well, thank you for today. I'm going to drop the link to the day 2 evaluations in the chat box for everybody. I will see you tomorrow, and we will send you an email today with the evaluation links. But we will see you tomorrow, same time, same place, 12:30 p.m. Central. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.